Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 98th AV discussion. My name is Adam Howell, and today we are continuing a great conversation we started back in April on what could AVs mean for Black Americans. And today, in this part 2 panel, our panelists are going to go beyond identifying race-based inequality as an issue and focus on the strategies the industry can take to operationalize equity. The group will discuss strategies like fostering partnerships with important stakeholder groups to connect Black communities. And back with us today is our wonderful AV panel of experts, Moderator Henry Greenidge of Tusk Strategies, as well as our panelists, Dr. Nadia Anderson and Dr. Shelley Francis. Thank you both so much for being here. I should say thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Adam. I really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back with you again to talk about this important issue. Again, my name is Henry Greenidge, and I am an EVP at Tusk Holdings, where I lead our mobility practice. Thank you to PAVE for just hosting this conversation. Last time we ran over, and so that is why we are having a part 2. We all know that in addition to the technical challenges associated with deploying autonomous vehicle, there is indeed a hurdle, and that hurdle is winning the trust of consumers. And within that, there's the Black community, which has been historically marginalized and is often left behind as technology advances. Now, during part 1, we explored the lessons that AV developers have learned over the course of the last century in transportation when it comes to operationalizing equity. And today we want to talk a little bit about the strategy. Now, we looked at the historical perspectives. Our panelists talked about the importance of strategic outreach, intentional community engagement, both to dispel myths and also to foster open dialogue. We discussed the importance of ensuring diversity in hiring practices by recruiting Black engineers and other specialists. But we want to dig a little bit deeper. So today we're joined again by our panelists, Dr. Nadia Anderson and Dr. Shelley Francis. Now, I call them panelists, but really they are experts. And in this field, this is what expertise looks like. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in terms of taking a look at inequity in transportation and the impact of technology, it's really been Black women who have been at the forefront of this work and studying this work and the researching and the communicating of this work. And at the end, I'm going to share some resources that could be helpful as you all seek to understand this a little bit better. So let's get into it just a little bit. I have a question for both of our, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce our panelists. Let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Nadia Anderson is currently the Director of Federal Affairs at INRIX. She has experience at Cruise, where she served as Senior Manager for Government Affairs and focused on their San Francisco deployment. She's also spent time at Uber, where she was the road safety and traffic lead, and has spent some time at AAA as well. She is joined by Dr. Shelley Francis. Shelley Francis is the founder and managing partner of both EVHybridNoire and EVNoire. Both organizations are at the forefront of leading this discussion. And so I'd like to ask a question to the both of you. We're going to start with you, Dr. Francis. And that question is, I'm looking for a yes or no and the why. And we're going to get a little spicy. The question is, can the AV industry avoid or counteract the ways in which the current transportation system has allowed and even perpetuated racial inequity and injustice in both rural and city centers around the country? Can we reverse course? Can we use this as an opportunity to address this inequity that persists even today? And again, I'm looking for a yes or no and why.
So I will say yes with a caveat. So obviously, I know, okay. So, and the caveat is that obviously when you talk about the intersection of mobility, transportation, policy, and the Black experience or experience of communities of color, but I'll speak specifically to the Black experience because I feel like I can speak to that experience without question, is that when you look at the historical context, it evolves over several hundred years. So we can't solve the problem with just one investment, even though this, and I'm referring to like the transformational investment that we've seen around transportation and infrastructure, clean transportation over the last year. So this is a starting point. So it's not going to solve all the ills of the past couple hundred years, but it's certainly going to make an impact and a dent. But there's opportunities to make sure that we do things very differently from what we've seen occur and happen, particularly with just communities who are disproportionately impacted by transportation inequities, which Black and Brown communities, African American Black communities being one of those communities.
Excellent. Okay, so that's yes with a caveat. All right, Dr. Anderson, up to you. Where do you stand?
So to make the conversation spicy and balanced, I'm going to say no with a caveat. But you'll notice my explanation is going to be very similar. I think the inequities and the hurdles are systemic, and they've been around for hundreds of years. So one piece of the transportation puzzle is not going to be able to solve it alone. However, I think AVs are pivotal because they have the opportunity to learn from all the lessons of how other innovative technologies, alternative fuel vehicles have rolled out. And they have the opportunity to leverage technology, including social media, including the ability to make this a broader conversation than it's been in the past, to begin thinking about and moving differently. So no, they can't change it on their own. However, they do have the opportunity to be we call them a key informer or a key stakeholder who can be pivotal and a thought leader that can change the tide or be at the forefront of helping to change the tide as we think about our systems as a whole.
Okay, so we've got a yes, we've got a no, and no one asked me, but I'm going to throw a maybe out there. And here's my reasoning or my caveat. When you look at the history of transportation, we know that it has been built on top of the housing ecosystem. We know that there were many different parties complicit in perpetuating inequity and keeping the races separate and keeping resources separate. And they were successful, yes, over time, over a number of years, but because you had so many different parties all on the same page, working towards the same goal. I don't know if we have that today. And we're going to get into this a little bit later, but we've got an administration that is, embrace equity, embrace reaching out to communities. But do we have all facets of our population engaged in this issue enough to make a difference? Is the AV industry engaged and on the same page enough to make a difference? And so that is what I sort of throw back out to you all.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so Dr. Shelley, I'm really interested in some of your perspectives as the founder of EVHybridNoire, which is the nation's largest organization of diverse EV drivers. As you know, there are a lot of analogies between electric vehicles and AVs. Many of us hope that once we get to a point of full deployment with AVs, that all of them will be electric. But my question to you is more about some of your members. I'm wondering if you can share with us any of the concerns that you're hearing directly from your members about autonomous vehicle deployment, testing, and how the industry is doing to ensure that Black people are included in this transformational technology.
So I'll start off with some of the concerns first, and then I'll talk about, things that the industry can do to engage Black communities. So first, some of the concerns in our membership base, just to kind of give you an idea of what the demographics look like in terms of, so we have people all ages. So from the youngest member is in high school all the way up to retirees. And in between, we have folks, from all different, SES income levels, educational levels as well, different countries. So some of the concerns that we've heard, namely one is that, okay, I'm afraid of this technology because it's lack of information and education and awareness. So one, fearfulness. Two, what will this cost? Is the infrastructure ready to adapt to this type of technology? I'm not going to get into this car with no driver in it. Like that maps onto the fear conversation. Also, if I'm walking out in front of this vehicle, will the vehicle see me? Will it know to stop? You know, how does that happen? Like, catch me up on the safety features of the technology. So that all kind of ties into that fear, the perception narrative. So that's, now we also do here. So I touched on some of the maybe not so positive feedback, but very informative and impactful. It needs to be considered. The positive things is that, oh, wow, this is going to really solve a transportation need and gap for a lot of different people who have may have limited mobility. Some of the current electric vehicles, if you're in a wheelchair, there's not many options for you to select in terms of getting an electric vehicle. Like, there's some vans and some bigger SUVs that can be retrofitted, but the auto industry is now starting to pay closer attention to the millions of Americans who need more access in their vehicle. So there's an opportunity to address ADA and mobility needs. There's an opportunity to provide safe transportation to urban and rural communities that may have different transportation needs. There's an opportunity to address the aging community who at a certain point in their lifespan may no longer be able to drive safely. So they still have to get to their appointments. They still want to get their hair done. They may want to have go to church or lunch. And so this will provide an opportunity to not miss out on some of life's, most engaging aspects. So those are some of the perceptions and the feedback that we've heard and seen from some of the study that we've facilitated in terms of opportunities where AVs can like lean in and work better with Black communities. One is that we have to train more people that are reflective of those said communities to be part of guiding this research and advising these companies. Part of that we're doing in our work with our e-mobility fellowship, which is a partnership that we have with HBCUs, and we're training the next generation of young professionals to work in this space and share their lived experience, gain expertise so that they can sit at these tables and help shape policy, strategy, pilots. So that's one piece of it. Approaching communities with a trusted partner is another critical concept because of all the systemic and institutionalized racism and discriminatory practices and policies that have been in place. There's there's deservedly so some trust issues that communities are experiencing. So being able to like build community in an authentic way before you even need to ask the community for something is really impactful. And it shows that you're not just in here because I'm helicoptering because I need to put this data together for this proposal or to get this approval from state regulators. It's building a lifelong or a long-term relationship with community partners because you are vested in seeing the successful and safe implementation of this technology.
I think what you just talked about is key because I feel as though, when we're talking about the Black community, and this could clearly be my perception, a lot of it can be negative in terms of their feeling on autonomous vehicles. And what you just described is something that's non-monolithic. There are varying viewpoints on this, but one thing I want to hear from you on is how can AV companies in particular lean in to the support that exists today in the Black community? One of the things you also mentioned was HBCUs, and I don't want to get too far down the line because I want to come back to that. But in what ways can AV developers work with Black communities where the support already exists?
Is that back to me?
That is back to you. And Dr. Anderson, if you have thoughts, please chime in.
I'll talk on it briefly because I also want to make sure I stay space for Dr. Nadia to chime in. But I'm super excited on ways that the AV industry can work with the Black community. And of course, the Black community, air quote, is not monolithic. There's a lot of diversity within the community. If you look at the people who are represented even on this call, our panelists and moderators, we are very different. We have some Afro-Caribbean, and there's other things mixed in there, Native American heritage. So we're very diverse. It's not monolithic at all. But broadly, today's conversation, we're talking about, all of those different perspectives and the importance of those. So in terms of ways that AV companies can lean in, there are our HBCUs are a great place. They're a great training ground for our next generation of leaders. There's a number of programs via either engineering schools or transportation centers and transportation programs that are already doing great research around AV, EV. Can we say names of schools that are doing this type of work? Can I call those out?
Absolutely, please.
Okay. So we have like Morgan State has a Center for Transportation Studies. North Carolina E&T has a Center for Transportation Studies. And there's Texas Southern is doing things around AV technology, and they're doing pilots in Greensboro as we speak around an AV shuttle in those communities. So there are things that are happening. There's research that's happening at these institutions, as well as institutions that are non-HBCUs, but since we're talking about the Black community and just thinking about the next generation of leaders, like let's work with these partners because they already have established relationships. They're doing research, they're doing testing, they're getting funding from the Department of Energy and all of these different federal and private funders to do the same thing that some of the AVs are trying to do. And it would make sense to collaborate and put resources together to move this work forward, particularly if there's already a commitment to working with these communities. I know some of the work that we've done is kind of making a marriage between the HBCU community as well as working in AV. So we are kind of like the go-between and bringing these two worlds together to move this conversation forward. I think there's a lot of strengths in the partnership. I mean, there's also obviously things that you have to work out, and, private industry, when you come and work with the HBCUs, you have to come with the same resources that you would come with going to historically a PWI institution. You can't just put, you have to come with the same type of commitment and resources because there are different needs. It's a different audience. And again, so there's opportunities, but they have to be packaged in the right way and approached, I think, in the right way as well.
So that's
Yeah.
great.
I want to add on to that, Henry.
Okay,
Let me jump in quickly on that.
Perfect.
I want to jump in on the HBCU piece. In addition to calling out the schools that Dr. Shelley mentioned, like also Bowie State is a good place to look. Also Virginia State University, good places to look for the talent. And for those who may be a little overwhelmed by the list of schools we're throwing out, like the National Science Foundation has an HBCU Up program that focuses specifically on STEM. So if you're looking for like a point of contact who can help you figure out how to navigate the landscape that is the world of historically Black colleges and universities, you can go to that aggregator for assistance there. When it comes, I want to double click on the point that Dr. Shelley made about your intentions and how you approach our historically Black colleges and universities and leveling the playing field, meaning approaching them in a manner that is very similar to how you engage with the PWIs. I will say, as a person who's worked in a number of tech companies, nobody knows how to work in tech until you get inside of the tech company. Nobody understands the business aspects, or they understand the problems you're trying to solve or your approach until you get indoors. What I've seen anecdotally is when our historically Black colleges and universities are approached, there's a different expectation for the student. They're expecting the student to come ready to go and hit the ground running. Whereas when you approach my undergraduate University of Virginia, there's a little bit more leeway in learning and education that's baked in. And so the thing that I will say is when you approach our historically Black colleges and universities, have that same energy that you have when you go and recruit from University of Michigan or from MIT. Like, understand that you're going to have to cultivate this person and make sure that they know your business and they know how you operate, because the talent is there and the eagerness is there, and there's an immense value with having the students like at the table, not only when it comes to the engineering side of the house, but also bringing it into the policy functions, the comms functions, the marketing functions, the operation functions, the safety management systems that are being spun up as well, because the knowledge base is there. So just making sure you're tapping in in a manner that is uniform and can lead to the results that we want to see.
I appreciate that. So Dr. Anderson, I want to stick with you, but I also want to mention Howard University also has a transportation center. I went to Hampton University, a noted rival. So forgive me, Hampton people, for calling out Howard, but we've named a number of institutions: Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland. So they're definitely out there, these resources. Dr. Anderson, just shifting gears a little bit, I want you to talk a little bit about you. I'm interested in your experience in particular. You worked at Cruise. I should note for the audience, I also worked at Cruise, and we were on the same team, but did not work together. But I'm really interested in a couple of things. Cruise is out there testing in San Francisco. They've announced that they're going to be testing in Austin as well, and in Arizona. Really interested in the approach to your work. First as a human, second as a woman, third, but certainly not least, as a Black woman. When you were looking to help Cruise with their testing and deployment plans with San Francisco, can you give us a sense of some of the concerns you may have had, or your thought process, knowing that as a Black person, and Black people historically marginalized, your thought in sort of helping Cruise to move forward based on sort of who you are? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So before I directly answer, I'm gonna give a little bit more background, because the simple answer is I brought my whole self, to be very cliche, into the space when I was working for both Cruise and at Uber and at AAA and the Auto Alliance. I would say when I first started my career, it was in the automotive industry, and it was vehicle and technology policy. So you can imagine during the early 2010, it was a space that was very much male dominated. And it was also very much a space that was dominated by a certain type of male, meaning an engineer who moved to executive, but also people who are very familiar with automotive industry. I was usually the only woman in the room, if not definitely the only Black person in the room. And so I was able to absorb a lot in those spaces. I worked in the natural gas industry. That also is very similar, where it's predominantly male, predominantly white, predominantly from a certain part of the country where natural gas is produced. And so more rural, not used to, not metropolitan where I'm from. When I go into those spaces, I bring who it is that I am, meaning we talked about Black people not being a monolith. Like for me, I'm the youngest child, so I'm always interested in fairness. I am a Black woman, so I have that lens as well, but I also grew up right outside of the nation's capital in Virginia. And so I bring the lens of a person who understands how transportation works, who was impacted by the limitations of where I lived, meaning if I didn't have a car, it was relying on the metro or on the Fairfax connector, the public bus, to be able to get place to place. And so when I come to work into these mobility and transportation spaces, that's the lens that I bring. I also bring the lens of a person who went to a PWI for undergrad, but then historically Black college for my graduate degree, and then went to another school that was tier 1 research focused in Delaware when I got my doctorate. And so you absorb all those educational experiences, you learn how to talk to and interact with various people. So when I worked at Cruise, when I worked at Uber, I was able to blend those things into my engagement and approach. Specifically, when it came to San Francisco, I am a native of Virginia. So when I moved to California to work for Uber, I had to learn what the West Coast was like. I had to learn what San Francisco was like. And if anybody has worked in the political space, you know that San Francisco is a unique animal when it comes to how policy functions, how politics functions, and how the body politic, which is the body of people who are influential and shape the landscape, sort of move. And so because I came at a very academic approach, like I'm a transportation nerd, I like to understand things. I'm an introvert, I like to listen and figure out where the pieces are. That's exactly how I approached my work at Cruise. And it was a lot of listening before acting. It was a lot of understanding, the goals of the company, the mission that we were focused on working on at the time, but also figuring out where that actually fit in to the bigger issues that were at play. And then taking the time to do some old school, as we say, I don't want to call it grassroots lobbying, but it's taking the time to meet people. So my first couple months at Cruise, I literally was out in San Francisco showing up places at the police department, at any meeting where I thought there'd be anybody focused on transportation who I wanted to know, so I could be in the room and figure out what was going on. I would say that when I joined the company, there were no concerns I had. My one thing that I wanted to make sure was that we operated differently, because I come from a big rideshare company and I know how rideshare entered into many markets. I also know the impact that rideshare had on many communities that have been historically marginalized or kept from the table. And I also had this line of sight into how decisions are made when there is billions of dollars of valuation, on the table and being considered. And so going into Cruise, I was happy to see that the approach was different, especially when it came to being collaborative and working with cities. But I also knew it was going to be on me as the front-facing person to take the time to develop the relationships, to get to know what the issues of the city were, to understand better how transportation had been received and given from all the stakeholders that we were looking to engage in. And I think because I am, again, a policy researcher and a public policy person, I'm very interested in good policy. And I know good policy is very subjective, but making sure that you are doing things in a manner that actually align with your mission and serve the public good, but also figuring out a way that you can do something that is aligned with the opportunity that's before you from a business point of view. There were lots of conversations of, being one of the onlys in the room and raising the hand and saying, hey, I know you guys think it's one way, but it's actually this way. And here's why you should probably give some consideration to this movement. Or I know that, process or policy that we're thinking about makes sense, but here's how everybody's going to hear what it is that we're saying. And because of who I am, my own experiences personally and professionally, I was able to bring in and interrogate things from a different manner. And I think it also is something that I bring into any job that I work in. Like, I'm sure to be rare because of all these various, I'll say random in some ways experiences, but at the same time too, having that lens to say, well, maybe I'm wrong. Let me figure out, maybe my view is this, but let me figure out what so-and-so across the table made me think, because they didn't respond well when I mentioned this. And it's definitely more of an art than a science. And it's kind of figuring out, kind of where you fit in, and also making sure that you're doing so in a manner that I can go home and look at myself in the mirror at the end of the day and say that I tried to do some good, or I reflected my experience in a voice that was missing from the table. And sometimes it's kind of like I lost that battle and took it on the chin. Wasn't a knockout punch, but I definitely got hit in that one, and I need to figure out how to maneuver and move in a different way. So that's a long answer, but that's definitely how I approached my work, both at Cruise and the AV space, and how I continue to approach it as a professional and as somebody who is able to hold the microphone when it comes to having these bigger conversations and explaining what this could mean for the Black community, what this could mean for women, what it could mean for people who are living in urban environments that may not have access to mobility options and modes that are needed for personal, professional, social health and growth.
Wow, Dr. Anderson, I appreciate your answer. I think your response was beautiful. It was very articulate, and it was full. I think I had a different approach to my work, which speaks to the issue. My approach was that in these predominantly white spaces, I could not show up as my full self. There wasn't enough space for my full self. And so only a shell of myself came to work for many years. And I'm a little bit older than you, but there's a generation of people who are like that. You've just beautifully made the case for diversity and inclusion, and why it's so important, particularly for AV developers as they're launching this new technology. You want people to bring their full self so that those perspectives can be incorporated into the design, engagement, and policymaking process. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. I do want to go to a sort of related question for the both of you, and it's about the term equity. And I think it's really important for the AV industry to hear from us about this term equity. Now, it has gone mainstream. You see equity everywhere. And you see it, and a lot of times it's not defined. Equity can mean many different things to many different people. As we discussed before, the Biden administration has embraced the term through its policies and programs. Given both of your roles influencing federal policy, I would like you to give me a little bit more perspective on what you think the term equity means when government uses it. And are we still missing anything when it comes to Black Americans, even though we're seeing equity everywhere? What are we missing, and how can the AV industry help to address it? Who wants to start?
I can jump in. So I love the fact that everybody is now paying attention to the word equity. What creates a little bit of unreadiness in me is that it's running the risk of everybody just adding equity to sentences and not actually delving into what it really means. For me, it is very challenging in the American context to talk about equity and not be comfortable calling out Black Americans or the Black experience in some way, shape, or form. I do understand and appreciate that there are other groups that have been impacted by systemic racism and equitable treatment. However, if we're looking at where I would say the most harm that has been documented and is having direct correlation to the stats and facts that we see, it is the Black community. I also believe that if you address the hardest problem first, you're going to be able to impact and positively influence other things. I think what's what's missing from the conversations is that deeper level. Like, I think a lot of people are saying we're not going to be equitable in our approach. We are focused on transportation equity. But if you have a conversation, you can get 2 questions in, and then there's misunderstanding as to what that term means, despite the fact that it's well defined lots of places. I think there's a little bit of disconnection between seeing the term and actually being able to operationalize it. And I know that the USDOT is doing a lot to try to figure out how to operationalize equity and having those conversations of actually getting to acting in a manner that does address what we're trying to address and the issue that's there. But I think what's missing is that interrogation. Like, it needs to be, I don't want to call it uncomfortable, but it needs to be purposeful, and it needs to be a level deeper when you're going into speaking about equity and how you take an equity-based or rooted approach. And I think the other thing is that the equity doesn't work if there's not accountability. So you can say that you are going to focus on equity, that you're encouraging people to move in a manner that is equitable, but you need to also show that people are going to be accountable for their actions or inactions when it comes to that space, in very similar ways to how we treat any other regulation, legislation, or design intent with how we move and focus and operate. So that's, like, at a high level what I see going, what's missing, and where I would like to continue to see us continuing to push and move in the direction of when it comes to equity and the focus that we're giving it these days.
And what I will add is that it's interesting when you have the institutions that have perpetuated some of the systemic inequities and institutional inequities, who are now trying to reverse course and do work that is more equitable, or that is equity. And so there's this kind of dichotomy about, like, this is the this is the abuser and this is the person who was getting abused, now trying to shift. So I think there's that, trying to kind of tease out what that looks like. But for me, equity is making sure that people have what they need to be able to be successful in life, or having the resources and the tools. In addition to that, equity to me is also that it involves providing resources to Black Americans specifically, and that's what we're talking about, that they had not had in the past adequate access to these resources. And when you start talking about things like that, those conversations make people and organizations and government very uncomfortable. But based on past history, those are the things and the difficult conversations and the difficult policies and programs that need to be put in place to correct for the past inequities. So just kind of trying to sugarcoat it and, like, put a drape over this wound, the wound is not going to heal. You got to take that Band-Aid off and let it breathe and have some converse, put some ointment and, really get in there and really do the work to address the problem. So, I mean, I'm excited that, this is a bold, step that our current administration and states are mirroring this trajectory as well. It's not going to be an easy process. It's not going to be solved in the next year, the next 3 to 5 years. That's how the funding typically works, 3 years, 5 years. It's not going to be over. It's going to take lifetimes beyond when we are in this space to address what has happened over the past hundreds of years. But I think it's the starting point. And if we can train people that are like-minded, that are committed, that are also going to be allies, who may not be part of those groups that have been impacted, but they can be allies and help us move the research forward, help us move the policy and pilots forward. We're at the tipping point and we're at the beginning of the work. So it's cool to high five and pat ourselves on the back that we're going in the right process. But like Dr. Nadia said, like, you have to have the right metrics, and you have to be able to be accountable and be able to measure your success in a way that's meaningful and that makes sense.
Excellent. I want to shift gears a little bit. This question is for, and I do that a lot. I didn't ask anything that I said I would so far, and I appreciate your patience. I want to shift gears a little bit. I feel like we have to talk about this topic, and that is the law enforcement community and AVs and the Black community, right? And I was thinking about this. A friend of mine mentioned a company that I'm still learning about. So forgive me, I don't have all the facts here. But this company, I believe, is called Turn Signal. And And I believe what it does is it provides a solution that, quite frankly, every Black man who's ever been stopped on a road by a police officer could benefit from. I believe what the app does is once it is opened after you're pulled over and there is a law enforcement engagement, what it does is I believe it records and also provides a live attorney to observe the traffic stop. And what came to mind for me was, well, I wonder if, that technology can be adapted for autonomous vehicles to give the user some form of safety, the feeling of safety and advice. But in any case, what I'm wondering from you all is, what the autonomous vehicle industry can do when it comes to the Black community and its engagements with the law enforcement community. Nadia, as you know, in San Francisco, each AV company is required to submit a law enforcement interaction plan. I'm not sure if there was a requirement on how they address marginalized communities who are customers. So I guess the question is, what can the AV community do when it comes to Black communities and the level of distrust from the law enforcement community?
No, that's a really good question. I'm going to speak about being inside of the AV companies because that's where my experience lies, both at Cruise and then when I was at Uber as well. I will say that what I've seen to be most impactful is a plug for why diversity matters. You need diversity of thought, of opinion, of experience around the table while you're thinking through what your processes and protocols will be. And you need people who are in decision-making positions to be able to say, my lived experience is a little bit different. So let's talk about and figure out how we give some value and some weight to that lived experience when you're designing these law enforcement interaction plans. And when you're starting to think about things too that are social issues that immediately overlap with transportation when it comes to what happens when you're pulled over at the roadside and there's nobody driving the vehicle, it's just, me as myself in the back seat. How much access are you giving law enforcement? Because I'm also a woman. So how much access are you giving me to the outside public, et cetera? And I think that what's most powerful is having people at the table to be able to talk about it and give their experience and often share a different worldview. We were talking in the green room a little bit about this, back in the day in one of my many jobs, people were trying to figure out how to design research and studies to show if a person is under the influence of, cannabis or another Schedule I substance in the roadside, because the statistics were showing that alcohol is still definitely the main issue when it comes to impaired driving, but they're often over-the-counter medicine. And then, with the legalization of cannabis in many states, people are trying to figure out how do you measure if somebody is actually impaired because of cannabis. And conversations around the table are looking purely at the science. If you are under the influence, your heart rate may be going a little bit faster than normal, like an at-rest heart rate. So they were saying, well, maybe, police officers can check the heart rate and then use that as a way to sort of like get in and understand if there's the need for further testing for a blood test, et cetera. And I would say, luckily, there were a couple of us around the table. When I say us, I would say Black Americans who have different interactions and experiences, where I was able to say, regardless of what I'm doing, if I'm getting pulled over by a member of the law enforcement community, my heart rate is probably going to be elevated, whether I'm on something or not. So keep that in mind when you're trying to decide, what the countermeasures or interventions are going to be. And I would say the same thing applies to the AV industry. So there were lots of people at the table speaking about, okay, as we walk about or think about how we want to publish our interactions or engage, making sure that we take into consideration that there may be communities or populations where there's naturally some unreadiness, naturally some hesitation because of what's currently happening, but also they're looking for a level of like support from the AV company that's there, like knowing that many of the AV camera companies use cameras, LiDARs, and radar, being able to proactively answer the questions about how will this be used, or how could this be used as a manner to give me an extra level of comfort in the situation that it's at nighttime and I'm being pulled over by, lights or maybe by an unmarked car and I'm not exactly sure as the passenger what's going on and I have no control over the situation because I am a passenger that's removed from being able to either drive away or call, or they're going to be looking in the back seat. So I would say inside is why diversity matters. It's why engaging with different people with different backgrounds and perspectives matters. And it also matters to engage with members of the law enforcement community. Like I did a lot of work working with local law enforcement to understand what they were thinking. So not only their questions about technology itself, but also their questions about interacting with passengers. Because, coming from the rideshare industry, there are a number of types of passengers that get into rideshare vehicles, and you think that the same situation is going to happen, and you want to have your responders able to be responsive to those things. You have people who are inebriated and are making the right choice to not drive, but that also means it's a different interaction at the roadside, that you're going to have to be, socially aware and able to understand. You're going to have people who may not speak English as a native language because they're no longer driving, they're able to transport. Like, how do you have that interaction go? And I think that two-way conversation was definitely very productive and appropriate, but it also is based on the foundation of establishing a relationship before you get into those situations. Like, I was able to go and say, hypothetically, how do you think about this? We're thinking about this, and kind of get to a place where, like, okay, I understand your perspective, you understand mine. Let's go, I'm gonna go work internally and figure out what we can put together that meets the needs of both groups. But if you operate in a silo, you don't get that. And if you operate in a silo where everybody has a very narrow experience, you also miss a ton of things that are gonna likely happen, especially if AVs begin to scale, especially if AVs are scaling in metropolitan areas where there's a lot of like people diversity of experience, ethnicity, race, ableism, et cetera, in that space.
Shelley, do you have anything?
Man, I mean, Dr. Nadia,
I mean, yeah, I know, like
that response. I don't know if there's something else I could add. I mean, that was an amazing, comprehensive response on why it's so important. She hit ableism, she hit visual impairment, that perspective, having somebody who can, really speak to the breadth of DE&I in the AV industry, because there's so many, it's a new field. There's so many considerations, and new in the sense that it's, a new technology to most of the folks in the country versus some of us who are already, working in clean transportation. So there's just a lot of nuances, and there's a lot to consider. And that's why it's so beautiful and important to have those different perspectives, that can speak to some of those lived experiences that we need to make the technology better and safer and more user-friendly, usable. So yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't have concrete ideas here, but I think the perspective that Dr. Anderson shared is really helpful. And what I would offer to anyone who is listening or watching is that, these issues between the Black community and law enforcement, they run deep. We have recorded killings of Black people who have been stopped. And that doesn't leave your mind. And so I think when you're trying to design a technology for everyone, you do have to take a step back and realize that everyone's experience is different. And so if I were an AV company, I would want to address that with my consumers. How does it work when you're pulled over? What happens? What is the company's responsibility? What is your responsibility? There needs to be more clarity before I'm entering your vehicle. And so that's one thing I would offer up. We talked earlier about HBCUs as a potential place where AV companies can engage to educate. I'm wondering if you all can think of any other organizations or groups made up primarily of African Americans or Black Americans that makes sense to for AV companies to proactively reach out to engage with.
Yeah, I have a couple, but I want to go back to your question for a quick second because I thought of something to add. When it comes to organizations that are like member serving and the aggregators of those who are working in industry, I think the one thing I would say to, the PAVEs and the other the world, set your internal bar for how you define equity, and which you will tout and highlight as one of your member companies taking an equity-based approach, or an approach that is designed to address some of the gaps that we're talking about when it comes to women, when it comes to accessibility, when it comes to Black Americans. And then hold your members not accountable, but make sure your members are meeting that bar before you're going out and highlighting them for being, beacons and leaders within that space. An easy way to do that, because we recognize that expertise is spread and it's hard to be, the master of all these things. An easy question is, when a company or member comes to you with something, is to say, who else have you talked to about that? Is there another organization that you're working with in this space whose voice will also be, lended in and you're joining with yours? Like, we call them validators in the government affairs space. Like, we know that there are very few experts in equity. Dr. Shelley is one. But if you have folks who are companies and individuals who are private sector who are saying that we are taking an equity approach, they should be working with someone. They should be working with an advocate. They should be working with an academic. They should be working with somebody who is a a practitioner in the field. And an easy bar is to say that, we as an organization are not going to go out and ring the bell and show that you were doing equity in a very, very big way unless you've met X, Y, and Z criteria. So that was what I wanted to add to the other question. And now I'll get to your other question, but I'll let Dr. Shelley jump in on the other question first.
I want to add to that too, Dr. Nadia, that when the companies or associations are coming to Black communities and Black stakeholders, that they, as we talked about prior, that they come with the same resources that they would come to any other organization. So what happens a lot of times when we go, when we're working with partners, like you resource them for your time. So if you do this thing where I hate this term, I want to pick your brain. No, don't pick my brain. Pay my consulting fee. We can sit down once the check clears or the credit card clears, and then we can have a conversation that's mutually beneficial, and it's not a brain dump, and you're not picking my brain. But it's the same approach with community partners. Like, so they are experts. They are your consultants, and you should treat them in that respective manner in terms of being respectful of their time, paying them for their consultation and for their advisement. And that shows a level of respect, and just part of it is respect and, coming to the community with not just being extractive, but actually coming to the community with knowing that you want to learn and you want to contribute. And not just take things and then, disappear. So I see that a lot, like even, people do that to us, but definitely with community partners and community driven initiatives that, you got to resource communities. Like people don't have time to be on your calls at lunchtime or after 5 or on the weekend. And for free, they have let me tell you, a full schedule of things that they would rather be doing or need to be doing to survive, not just alone telling you what you need to do to get AVs in the community. Like there's a whole hierarchy of needs, and that is not really one of their top 3, most likely. So just, you have to remember that when you're engaging with, communities.
Yeah, just to echo that, it should be a mutually beneficial interaction. And it's very similar. I know this is something that we've talked about before, like treat your engagement with Black organizations, the community and associations the same way that you would treat any other. You don't approach other groups thinking that, I'm going to pick your brain for free, or I'm coming to have this idea and be totally like extractive and not actually giving something back or figuring out how to address a mutual problem. Like work to form a real collaborative. You asked about organizations and entities. NESB comes to mind, National Association of Black Engineers is one. There's National Black MBA. There's tons of professional organizations and associations that are focused on the Black community and working to build capacity within the Black community to be able to engage in these spaces. And so when you approach, you should look at it from a capacity building lens. Like, how can we work together over the long term? What need am I serving of yours? In addition to what it is that I'm looking to get from you? Is it better understanding? Is it perspective? Is it a pipeline of eligible candidates who are ready to work? Like making sure you're giving in addition to looking to be able to get something. And then, as Dr. Shelley mentioned, make sure you come with the same energy, resources, and time that you approach other organizations with. So think about how you would go after or go to look to engage an organization that was focused on women's rights or women's health. What would you want to have in place before you had that conversation? And before you go to any Black community, Black organization or association, make sure you come with your proposal and your package ready and knowing what it is that you are looking to give, but also be very clear about what it is that you're looking to get. I will say too, like if you approach a situation with a transactional lens, you're going to get a transactional experience. And that's not necessarily what you want. And that's not necessarily anything that's going to be helpful to the goals that I believe are shared amongst, us on this call, AV industry, other practitioners and stakeholders there. So just, keep those things in mind as you begin to move forward, as you begin to engage.
I think that's such a great point. The point about if you approach it with a sort of transactional mindset, I think that's the mistake that I see a lot. And what we're trying to do here is create a relationship, and that's critically important for these organizations. I'm glad you mentioned National Black Engineers. I can never remember what it stands for. NESB. That's a great organization. I would also add fraternities and sororities. Those are great community-minded civic membership organizations. I would also add African American Mayors Association to that. There are a number of other organizations, including churches, which are, huge places to convene, where there is a sense of community. And so if you're looking to engage with the Black community, the churches are a great place to look. We are running low on time. I did want to encourage anyone to add questions to the chat. And I did want to open it up to you all, Dr. Francis and Dr. Anderson, if there was anything in terms of final thoughts that you wanted to share. I know I wanted to mention at the outset that EVNoire had released a policy toolkit that seeks to help policymakers, elected officials, operationalize equity when it comes to e-mobility. I think a lot of those principles can be adapted by the AV industry. So I did want to put that out there as well.
And I will say, if you didn't attend our National E-Mobility DE&I conference last week, you missed a treat, because a lot of these topics were covered in our panels. So I would definitely recommend that if you see it come out next year, when we save the date, definitely put it on your calendar, because it's a robust discussion similar to what we're having now, with real conversations and real examples of ways that we can move this conversation forward in a real world way.
Excellent.
Yeah, and the last thing I would say too is that the conversation that we're having today and that we started in April is tremendously important for progress, but also for the future and health of the industry. I would say that the resources are out there, like we all have access to Beyonce's internet, and at the same time too, we all know how to use, the internet and find the people who are working on it. There is a lot of excitement, a lot of attention coming from the Black community, and there's a desire to be involved, and just making sure that you are taking the steps to bring in folks, to make sure that you're opening doors, that you're providing opportunities, but also that you're listening, hearing, and incorporating their perspectives and what it is that folks have to say into how we decide to move forward when it comes to scaling, growing, and making sure AVs are a benefit to mobility and equity and transportation and safety.
Excellent. I don't see any questions in the chat, so it sounds like we've figured out this really complex problem by ourselves. Just kidding. Any final thoughts from our experts?
Thank you for creating the space for us to have this conversation. It's not an easy conversation, and we tried to add like a little humor to it and to kind of normalize it, but it is really important. I think it's a really conversation that we need to keep having, and not shy away from having those difficult conversations, because even I've learned things from having this conversation today, and I hope the audience, since they have no questions, I hope they've learned a lot too. Maybe we've just shocked them and stunned them into silence.
I too want to thank PAVE, and also thank Henry for facilitating this conversation for the second time, for being provocative, for making sure that we are informed. I too learn a lot from both of you every time we get on the line together, both online and offline. So kudos to you, Henry, for leading this work, for being a thought leader, for being an expert in the space as well. It's always good to be in good company. Iron sharpens iron. So it's good to have you all in the space. I love it.
Thank you.
Dr. Nadia, you must have grew up around some old folks, because you have some great one-liners.
We do. We absolutely do.
My parents are baby boomers. They're full of them,
Oh, yes. Love it.
Before we depart, I just wanted to mention a couple of resources. Number one, again, I have to emphasize that there aren't many leaders in this space. The ones who are leaders, they're mostly Black women, and they're incredible women like those who are our experts today. I would mention probably Dr. Destiny Thomas. I would mention probably Tamika Butler. I would mention Salika Talbot. I would mention there are plenty of others out there. Reagan Patterson. Some of the resources that I would point folks to are a mixture of books and papers. So some of the books include Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble, Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin, Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks. I would also mention the Arrested Mobility podcast, which is a good one. And I think that's it for now. And please feel free to reach out if you're interested in any of those resources. I'm happy to share them with you. And I see Dr. Francis put the EVHybridNoire public policy toolkit in the chat. Excellent. Okay, so I think that about does it. Let me just check to see if there are any questions. Seeing none. It was great joining you all for part 2. And I think we all are available on LinkedIn and potentially Twitter. So looking forward to connecting.